I want to thank Sources of Knowledge people for inviting me here, and John and other folks dragging my body up here in order to talk about something that's really close to my heart, which is Sublimnos. You know, I was sitting there thinking as I was listening to all the other speakers, and I thought, you know, I recognize the pattern, or you know, the first couple of guys who I know, Stuart and what's his name? The doctor guy. It's called senility or old age thing. Mr. Harper. And I noticed that these guys have all started off with a passion, and they continued on with doing what they do, and it hasn't subsided. And then I listened to what I would regard as a younger crew that aren't talking about 40 years plus, and talking about what they're involved in, and even and with the same sort of passion. And they're going on and they're doing phenomenal things and great. And I also pick up the odd comment and talking to people, and something I noticed is that they kind of said, somebody pays me to do this. And you know, and I looked out, and as I stand here, I guess, and as I look out in you, and I see you, and I think I'm 23 years old, and I look out in the crowd, and I thought, how did I get here? You know, and you're turning around looking at a guy who's probably obviously a grandfather, and most likely a senior citizen. He said, how did he get here? Well, and then you talk to people about something called Sublimnos, and they said, what's that? And I figured, ooh, they don't know. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about a history and the passion, I guess, that this machine or this underwater structure, what happened here. You notice, the other thing that I noticed too is that Tobermory seemed to be taking off in the late 60s and into the 70s, and then continued on to there. And Sublimnos is right in the middle of it. Now, what we're going to do is, if we can, there we go. I have an introduction by the guy who couldn't make it, who I was talking to just yesterday.
1969 was a golden year for human exploration. The U.S. Navy had its Sealab project, and NASA was going to send those first astronauts to walk on the moon. I wanted to be part of this quest, but when you don't have any money, you have to think smarter. I'd worked with the $10 million Navy Sealab project, so I thought I knew something about what could be done on a shoestring budget. National Geographic gave me a $15,000 grant, and I built Sublimnos, our underwater station and science center. She was 16 feet tall. She had a lower ballast chamber and an upper living chamber, and that living chamber had 4 windows, a skylight, and could hold 4 people. A wonderful team of volunteers came together to make this project possible. They included Dr. Alan Emery, a marine biologist at the Royal Ontario Museum, who headed our science projects, and Doug Elsey, a professional marine engineer who headed our engineering research projects. And with these and dozens of other volunteers, we had a 2-year project of science and education beneath the waters of Lake Huron. Thousands of dives were made. More than 2,000 divers participated in this project, and some of them were from 10 universities. Sublimnos was a transformative invention. She changed the way we think about fresh water, its power, its processes, its biology, its geology. And there's no one more qualified to tell her story than my good friend and diving companion, Doug Elsey.
I had to pay him $50 to do that. And it cost me a half a case of wine. But I think he drank the first half of the half, which would be a quarter, before he did it. Anyhow, Joe gives his apologies. He couldn't make it, but I think we'll tell the story. And what I'm going to tell you, I guess, is a story. And it's not about 40 years ago. It actually goes longer than that. It's going to be about my journey through it, and how it affected me, how it affected others, and where it is today, where it's going, where it's gone, what it's done, how it affected a lot of people. it's a considerable piece of machinery, habitat, and for me, it starts off in Thunder Bay. That's a cold place, and in Thunder Bay, I guess I was just a young kid, and I'd grown up on Lake Superior, and I looked out at that thing, and I was wandering around, and I thought, my God, look at this sea, this huge, vast part of water. I guess I want to be part of that. Do I want to be a sailor? I don't know. I said, I've got to go play in this. Everybody been in Lake Superior, I guess, with the bathing suit, you only last about 2.5 seconds. I mean, that's before your ankles just absolutely kill you even going into the water. You're best to be thrown in, I guess. So anyhow, as I was sitting up there as a little guy, I figured, I saw this, my dad took me to a movie, and it was called The Silent World. Silent World was by Jacques Cousteau, and I remember these guys, the opening scene is going down with these flares, and I thought, whoa, is that ever cool? And then also talking to people, I would say, how many have been inspired by Jacques Cousteau? There'd be 100 hands. Or if they remember who Jacques Cousteau, it might be Michel Cousteau or some of the Cousteau people or whatever. So off I went, and then being Thunder Bay, it's a long way north from here. The only way you could get any information was to turn around and write, and I sent away for a book called Diving with Safety. So I read the book with Diving with Safety, and I said, well, this is cool. And in part of it, I noticed, I guess, they were talking about underwater living. And I thought, well, to live under the sea, that would be really neat. And Jacques Cousteau's doing it. And I figured, how do I do that? And then Sea Hunt came along. Oh, hey. If you saw it in its first run, welcome to geriatrics. Okay? It's still around, but Lloyd Bridges was there. And then that was followed by, who remembers this one? The Aquanauts. No, that came on just after Sea Hunt. But the big thing is, notice old Lloyd Bridges there with the double hoses. Look at the Aquanauts, single hose. That was the cool stuff, that you had to do that. Anyhow, that was it. I was hooked. Here I am, Doug Elsey, standing above the crowd in advanced diving technology since 1956. I was going to be a diver, and I had that big 3-foot snorkel, and I heard stories here about when George Harper was talking about, putting on a face mask and a long hose and doing that. I remember taking a snorkel and taking a mouthpiece, put it on the end of a hose, and we built a little raft and stuck a garden hose. We had 50 feet of hose there. Jumped in with a weight belt on and damn near died, and physics is physics. So I was going to be a diver. That's what I wanted to be. I want to be a diver. I'm going to be Jacques Cousteau and do all this thing. I'm going to live underneath the sea, I think. So by 14 years old, I started up a skin diving club, and it was called the Snorkel Snoopers of all things, because they wouldn't let me in the other big guys diving stuff. So I think it was about 10. So off we went, and by the age of 14, I could free dive down to 120 feet. So I was pretty good at it. And by the age of 16, at 12 years old, a friend of mine who happened to be a rich kid charged us $1 a minute to breathe on a scuba tank, and that really did some. What's that? About $1,000 a minute now. But anyhow, so that's the only taste I got of compressed air. So by 16, I was a self-taught scuba diver, and by the time I was about 18, I was commercial diving. And by the time I was 20, I was a NAUI certified instructor, one of the early ones. And I thought, well, I want to be a commercial diver. Now, the joke goes in the commercial diving world even today. And they say, well, I'm going to be a commercial diver. And they said, oh, don't tell your mother that. Tell her that you're a piano player in a whorehouse down in New Orleans. You're better. Because divers get into a lot of, and you're always traveling, you're on your way. But I wanted to be a diver and a commercial diver. But a significant part of my happened is 1965, there was an article by National Geographic that came out, and the article was called The Deepest Days. And The Deepest Days was run by a guy by the name of Dr. Ed Link. And Ed Link had designed this underwater habitat as we call them that day. These days, I'm going to use the word habitat and station, either or, because the habitats where all the fishies live and stations are where the peoples live. He designed this underwater habitat, as I would call it, which was called SPID, Submersible Portable Inflatable Dwelling. And this thing was approximately 8 feet long, about 4 feet in diameter, and had a trunk on it. And they were going to take it down to 432 feet, and they were going to live there for 24, 48 hours. And that was the very first time they were doing saturation diving. And here's a shot of it sitting on the bottom in the Bahamas being tested. And these guys lived in here for 24, 48 hours. This is them coming up, doing the decompression. Here's some cans that were crushed by the pressure down at 432 feet. A significant thing for me, which I'll tell you about later. And this is a shot of the chamber and the divers decompressing on it. But I noticed one thing. Who was this guy? The guy sitting in the middle. I joke with the balding head, and then he gets mad and mentions something about my weight. And so I took this, and the thing that got me about this whole underwater living thing was Canadian, eh? That was Dr. Joe McGinnis. And this was one of his first jobs when he went down when he was down in the States and worked for Ed Link. So I somehow found his address, or wrote to Ed Link, I think, Ed Link in Bahamas, Florida, or anyhow, and I says, I'm Canadian too, eh? There's the link. And I want to live and work under the sea. And how do I get to do what you do? I have no money. McGinnis writes back, follow your dreams and instincts. Get an education. Work hard. And I have no money either. Oh, the part that got me was get an education. I figured, how do I get involved in this? I mean, McGinnis was a doctor. I figured, I was interested in engineering, so I guess I'm going to go be in engineering, and I could also be a commercial diver too, but my prediction was when I got old, fat, and ugly, I wouldn't want to be diving, and I achieved that part. And I figured, you're going to have an education to do something rather than swinging a hammer underwater and freezing everything off. And anyhow, so that's what I did. Packed it up, headed for Ryerson, and taking engineering technology. And then in my last year, I look out in front of the Royal Ontario Museum, and there sits this underwater structure called Sublimnos. McGinnis had actually built it, and he had installed this thing down at the Royal Ontario Museum with a grant from National Geographic. And he was putting it on display for a couple of months. That was in my last year. And then what happened is my last year also, though, I just by chance happened to be reading through Skin Diver magazine. And I read about a university downstate called Florida Atlantic University who just started an ocean engineering program. But the thing about it was, McGinnis had been working on the Sea Lab programs with the United States, and all the undersea living that he had done with Link. And FAU was also working with the Sea Lab program and the Man Under the Sea program. That's where I went. Off I went down to Florida Atlantic University, didn't have much money. Don't forget, I told McGinnis and I didn't have any money, I didn't. So now I went down there and I went into signed up for their co-op work study program, which meant 6 months in school, 6 months working in the field, an internship, I guess was what they would call it now. So I wrote to McGinnis again, just saying, I understand you have the Sublimnos program going on. How do I get involved? And I told him I was at FAU, and I didn't know it at the time, but then I find out he's on their board of advisors down at FAU about underwater living through the Link Foundation. So I told him about it, and he definitely knew what FAU was all about, and frankly, he remembered the letter I had written him 3 years earlier. He comes back, we need to talk. which begins my story. Sublimnos, a spark in the ice, beneath the ice. The title, I looked at it, and I guess trying to figure it out, and what it was for me, it was beginning, I guess what I'd say is, it was like an Alice in Wonderland thing, where she's chasing the rabbit, and this was the rabbit hole. And when I first saw Sublimnos, when it had been installed, Little Dunks Bay, in the summer of 1969, and there's Little Dunks Bay as it sits there. The first time I ever saw it was through a hole in the ice. And I had gone out to the site, saw this hole in the ice, a commercial diver, that doesn't scare me. And middle of a snowstorm, a guy by the name of Larry Bell, who a lot of you may have known, past tense, Larry passed away, by the way, last September. Went out there, and Larry says, I says, well, where is it? And he says, well, there's right through that hole in the ice. So down we went, and the thing was all lit up. And it was like going through the rabbit hole. Well, I've never, ever returned. I'm into my fantasy, and I've gone. It's beyond that. We had rented a place just up the highway, which we called the greenhouse because it was painted green. Duh. I noticed it's painted white, but it still looks like that. And McGinnis had rented the house for about 2 or 3 years, I guess, at the time, and that's where we stayed. Larry Bell was the on-site resident biologist and was with the program for almost to its I got to take this off. There we go. I can see my picture. And Larry was running the program for the biology. And what I did notice is that when I went into the back room, this is what I saw. We were sponsored by National Geographic. There was more Nikon cameras than I've ever seen in Henry's ever. There was all sorts of stuff. There was boxes and boxes and boxes of film and cameras and everything you dream of, underwater housings. And I was an amateur photographer at the time, but this is big time. I was heading, I'm going to do National Geographic. So anyhow, we were told to shoot at least 2 rolls of film every day, 36 exposures, every single day we're there. Send them down to National Geographic. They would develop them all, send them all back again, send us copies of the ones that they'd chosen. So talk about a learning experience. We just went, up we went. And here it is sitting in the bay before it was launched, and the volunteers are turning around and they're painting it, they're getting it ready for its launching. And Sublimnos looks like this, or looked like this. It was a modified liquid sugar container. It was 16 feet high. It had an upper and lower ballast chamber. The upper was for living for 4 people. There was lower ballast was a ballast chamber. It was full of little iron ore pellets, and it was supplied by air, communications, and hot water that was pumped from the shore. And we had to have a hatch depth of under 33 feet. The reason that means because beyond 33 feet is more than 1 atmosphere. If it was deeper than that, we would have ran into a saturation diving problem. So the hatch depth was carefully chosen. This was called the Bargain Base Habitat, and we had lots of people visiting us. This was out of Mechanics Illustrated, and they came up and talked about the habitat, and it was big news. We dove under the ice continuously right through the program and stayed with. We ran it. I was going to say 24 hours a day. We didn't, although there were a couple of 24-hour-a-day experiments there. We ran it underneath the ice. We ran it at night. We ran it 7 days a week. The thing was go, go, go all the time. This is the summer of 1970. Not this summer, but it looks like a little bit like it does now. This is the onshore. Supply band. Actually, this is the only picture I could find of it. The shack, that was after a storm, and the window had broke. But in it was a underwater communication system. There was hot water running down to the habitat because we had a hot water heating system in it. And we could stay down there for hours. We would stay down there sometimes 6, 8 hours at a time. We would take out a bunch of scuba tanks and put it alongside, and then we'd run programs on it. This is some of the kids that were young people, educators that came out to the site and were involved in programs with it. And running in the spring, and it went on, like I said, almost continuously. Around the Sublimnos also too was some underwater little little spheres that we used we used to call them the telephone booth, and we used to go out there, and you could take your regulator out and talk. And there's me when I had hair. We also did a lot of testing on some brand new equipment. McGinnis, because the way he was hooked up with Sea-Lab and the Americans and everything, we got all the latest diving equipment, rebreathers. This is one of the original rebreathers. We used the Electrolung. We used the thing that they used to call the Mark 10, which was the U.S. Navy's underwater rebreather. Underwater experiments and studying being done for sea lamprey and other things that the scientists came on to look at. In total, there was about 10 universities that came into the program and over 2,000 divers. The place was extremely, extremely busy. We had Philippe Cousteau come up here for about a week. And Cousteau came up and actually, what an opportunity. We'd sit down there and we talked with him for hours and about what was happening underneath the sea and all the rest of that was going on. David Dubélé from National Geographic, one of his first assignments actually was Sublimnos, and came up and shot up here. Other things that sparked people. When I went down and I saw that habitat and sitting in front of the Royal Ontario Museum, I wasn't aware that a guy whose name was James Cameron had also seen it. And he came down there, he was 15 years old, so of course I was a bigger guy than him. But anyhow, he did a sketch of the Sublimnos, and he asked McGinnis how to build one. He made himself as his own little baby habitat, put a mouse in it, and dropped it over in Chippewa Creek. And he asked McGinnis, how do you build one of these things? And of course, I guess a mouse in a mason jar. He survived all right, and it came back up. But anyhow, that year, Cameron wrote a script for a story, which later on became The Abyss, which was about people living in an underwater habitat, and it was produced, of course, 20 years later. SPID, McGinnis, still hooked up with Link. I went down and I got SPID, and from Ed Link down in Harbor Branch, and spent 2 days with Link talking about Man Under the Sea, and we brought the sucker back to Canada. And we turned around and we installed it on the site of the Sublimnos area and put it, and actually had it inside. So there's 2 habitats down there at the time. And we're still running underwater programs in them. As a student, and I was starting to head back, McGinnis and I had been talking about a model and a concept, which one was made a little later, was something called Subiglu. And I recall McGinnis going out to me and says, we have to make this, I need a drawing. So we made the drawings of the first time of Sublimnos, and then of Subiglu, and then I later on went back and headed back to school, still in touch with McGinnis. The other thing was, there was an ad running at the time. If you were working here tomorrow, you'd be wearing a Rolex. Well, McGinnis was paying us $15 a week minus room and board, so you know how far that went. It took all summer. McGinnis one time he acted like he was very angry, said, you got to get your butt down to Toronto. So we left down there, and he says there's a meeting. And anyhow, we went to the meeting, and we were in Rolex, and we were presented with Rolexes because we were sponsored by Rolex too. I was thinking of selling it so I could go back to school. So anyhow, between 1970 and 1972, the program continued on, and was Larry was running all sorts of programs underwater, and it was quite a busy place. In the summer of '72, I had returned back after graduating, and Subiglu had become a reality. We actually had built it. We did some testing, and we tested in Little Dunks Bay in order to find out how this thing worked. And then what happened is that once it was all done, now there was 3 habitats sitting at the bay. We said we're going to the Arctic. Now this is all about, at the time, Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic was a big issue, just like it is today. And we were supported by the Canadian government, as in airplanes and all the rest of the stuff, to take Subigloo up to the Arctic and to put it underneath the ice and actually live underneath the ice. And though the people who did that were primarily drawn from the Sublimnos cruise. So up we went, tripping our way through 6 feet of ice, and we put the Subigloo underneath the water. And it was in 1972, December, the winter. Notice that was Arctic 3. There had been 2 other Arctic expeditions, one in the summer and one in the late fall that we had run. This was the one in the winter. We lived underneath the ice, and it's cold. That's not recommended. And from inside the habitat, the underwater station, we called the then Prime Minister of Canada, Trudeau, and talked to him that we had basically established an ice base underneath the Arctic ice. It was a big deal. It was lots of publicity at the time, quite a head trip. Recreation, as we used to run around underneath the ice and upside down, and there's a shot of the inside of the tent where we're going down to work on the Subigloo. This was still ongoing. In the meantime, down at Sublimnos, down here, there was a diving death. During the wintertime, we had, when we were diving through the ice at that time, we didn't use lines, because as soon as you go down, you'd see the habitat, and then you could follow the communications line back to the shoreline, and then work up and down the cliff. And what happened here was that the fella from University of Toronto had gone down, followed out, got to the interface. He was doing a crayfish study, and he went left instead of right. And then when he thought he was going to go back again, he kept going, and he drowned. And that was basically because of insurances and just because of the program was going, we decided to pull Sublimnos out of the water. Sublimnos was taken out of the water in about 1974, and it was removed by Seneca College, their underwater skills program, and headed up to Seneca. So Sublimnos now went to Seneca for about 1974 to 1987. And what it was used as an underwater bell simulation. And it was active in the program and served the students as like I said, as the bell simulation. During that year, with Seneca College support, we turned around, and then on the Arctic 4 expedition, which was 60 days long, up in 1974, we then went back up into the Arctic, this time to reestablish the base underneath the water. And that's us putting it together. This time it was in the springtime, so we had 24-hour light instead of 24-hour darkness. We put the station back on. We put the Subigloo back underneath the station. We did a live television broadcast from the thing called, I think, a Nukshuk, and it was broadcast via satellite. Now, these were the days in '74, whatever. There weren't many satellites up there. It was a big deal to have a live broadcast from underneath the ice. We also had taken SPID up there, and we took the SPID and we put the SPID under there, and we lived underneath the ice for 24 hours. We also, me as the guinea pig, also made the first deep helium dives in the Arctic. This was down to 220 feet, I guess, at the time. Not deep by today's standards, but when you're up in the middle of the Arctic and there's no real medical facility up there, it was almost suicidal. And we didn't know how helium would react in deep cold water and everything. I came back, and anyhow, and got another Rolex too, by the way, for it. Larry Bell also came up too, and he was running the oil under ice program and ran some oil underneath the ice and was doing a study there from under a scientific grant. And the most important thing is that in 1974 we dove the North Pole. April 28th, 1974, we dove the North Pole and we put the flag underneath the ice. And what that said is, those who can't read it, the top says Canadian flag planted under the polar ice cap, and there's the polar bears and the seals and the fish singing, "The true north, strong and free, we stand on guard for thee." So every time you read that the Russians were there, the first people were there, we already did it. We had been there. I was talking to McGinnis about a year ago. I said, well, why didn't they say we were there? And I said, well, it's been a long time. Everybody forgets. But anyhow, there it is. We have pictures. And you know what's coming next, eh? Oh, at any long expedition where you're running almost 24/7, this was an expedition in 1974 where we ran for 2 months straight. Every 2 weeks there'd be all these scientists coming in with their tails a little wagging away, 24-hour light, which meant they would tend to overwork. We got stressed. And on the stresses, I guess one of the part of it is that we even had a NASA psychologist there looking at us guys to see if we would go nuts, because they were looking about long-term space exploration. Well, we all have our own vision. So standing on the deck, with a knife in your teeth and you're come hell high water and you'll never fail. I learned everybody has about 5 weeks, and then they're turned into a little pile of Jell-O in the corner. And I've got my stories I'll tell you over a beer later on, but that was the thing. But in anything like this, we had to have a sense of humor. So we had these T-shirts, the Arctic Streaking Society, which was big, of course, in '74, and you had to streak in order to get a T-shirt. We even had the governor, or whatever he's called, from Northwest Territories come in and says, "I want that shirt," and we just stood there. He says, "As long as there's no cameras." Yeah. Well, I won't tell you whether you earned a shirt or not, but anyhow, to get the shirt, you had to do it. One of the best ones was Captain Canada. And my wife says, if you show anything that shows anything, you're going to be dead. So anyhow, how Captain Canada have it? We had a course set up that was 50 meters by 50 meters by 50 meters. And don't forget, this is just at the springtime. And what you had to do is totally naked, but you have a different theme. So I remember sitting in order to get the shirt. So I remember this fellow who's from Nova Scotia, Bedford Institute, who I won't mention him. All of a sudden I hear this scream, and there's this naked figure with a Canadian flag jumping across the tables, and out he goes out the door, and away he goes. And he had to run out 50 meters, over 50 meters, back 50 meters, and back again. Well, it's not that cold. It's cold. A couple of pictures, you'll see how cold it was. But anyhow, out he went. The hard part about it is that it's funny for the first 20 feet. Well, it was spring there, which means you had this thin crust of ice on the snow. So there you are in bare feet, and you go running across the road, and all of a sudden you start going through, and the water's this thing about this deep. So what happened, it was like going through broken glass. So I always had a medical kit back there, because we had severe lacerations all up and down the knees, and usually ended up in a big bloody pulp, lying on the ground, and we'd give him his T-shirt. After that expedition was finished, we then took the Subigloo, and Subigloo was then taken by Underwater Skills Program and then went to the Project SCORE. And SCORE was down in the States, and the Underwater Skills Program handled that. Now, going beyond Sublimnos for me, I'm going to do this real quick, was that basically after that was finished, there's a lot of people you meet on these expeditions, and one of the ones I ran into is a guy by Candive. For the next 25 years, I was a partner and I ran a division of Candive, and I'll go through this real quick. Each picture has an hour story to it, but I won't go into it. We use the gym suit to dive to 1,000 feet below the Arctic ice. We had normal underwater construction stuff where you're diving in sewers and holes and dams and rivers and lakes and all the rest of that stuff. We invented the thing called a newt suit, which is a swimmable gym suit. The suit that was in the first slide. We dove in high rivers up in the Mackenzie River Delta, high currents, and using technology where to dive underneath 30 feet of water in high currents. It was a dangerous job. Developing the deep rover underwater submersibles. We put this thing in underwater tunnels. We inspected tunnels with it. We did Arctic. We worked for Dome Petroleum for 5, 6, 7, 8 years, doing all the deep diving in Dome Petroleum in the offshore. We dove the offshore Newfoundland. We took our submersibles and we're actually involved in the making of the movie The Abyss. We helped find and dove the Breadalbane. And Parks Canada may talk to you about the hazards of bringing something up from the deep. That's another story. Yeah, I didn't do it. We're just hired to do it. And we went down and we salvaged the bell off the Edmund Fitzgerald and put a memorial bell down onto the Edmund Fitzgerald. It went on and on and on for 25 years. And you remember this thing? All those Nikon cameras. We had a tremendous education on underwater and surface photography. And as a result, I ended up becoming a photographer, which was something that ran parallel in my career. And now, as I do today, I shoot for NATO Special Forces, for the NATO Special Forces, for their deep diving people. So I fly all over the world, taking pictures of these guys blowing things up and underwater mines and stuff like that. And it's like being in the middle of it's like being in the middle of a James Bond movie, to tell you. And I mean, my shivers when it goes down my back when I think about hanging outside of helicopters, commandos running around, things blowing up, and I get to play, because in my head, I'm 23 years old. And some of the shots and the places that I've been. Curacao, Iceland again, blowing stuff up. Norwegian Arctic, in the middle of winter. It's a cold place. And some of the stuff that I do in adventure photography and stuff like that. Now, we get to the gist of it. I got 4 minutes, I think, don't I, John? Yep. Where's SPID? Okay, all this stuff is going on, and for me, still continues on. I'm still involved in commercial diving. I'm still involved. I do dive down south. The heck with going out here under the ice. I'd love to, though. It hurts my back and all the rest of that stuff, but I'm still actively diving. And to answer before I answer where's SPID, where's Sabiglu? Sabiglu, after it left the SCORE program, ended up in the Epcot Center down in Disney World, and was in their big aquarium there for 25 years. And you may or may not have seen it. It was a thing just sitting there with this big globe. And then and it was from the McGuinness Foundation, and we went down and checked it out, and the thing was corroding very badly. And so we ended up taking it out. We got it refurbished. It was part of the deal that we had with, I say we because I'm still involved in the McGuinness Foundation as their project engineer, if we ever have any more projects. And it's a loose relationship. We brought it out. It's been completely refurbished. It's sitting in a big box in Disneyland, looking for a place to live, and we're probably going to bring it back to Canada. And it could end up anywhere. It could be Museum of Man. It could end up here. Could end up. We're under discussion, is what I'll have to say. But where's SPID? When all this was happening, McGuinness and I would touch careers every so often along the way, just because we're busy with life. Joe's on other things. I'm doing other stuff too. All equally exciting and tremendously a lot of fun. But then I phoned up. I wonder where SPID was, and I called up Seneca College. And we talked to people, and after a little while, I said, well, do we know where it is? And there was a pause. It's in a landfill site. And that triggered, oh my gosh, here's, you got to be kidding. And a lot of embarrassment. It had been forgotten for so long. Nobody knew what it was, and they're cleaning up the yards, and off it went, and it ended up in the landfill. I have no idea where it is. The next question, of course, where's Sublimnos? It ain't here. Sublimnos, we tracked Sublimnos down. I had to do a lot of searching on the internet, and actually the Sublimnos had left Seneca in about 1986, 87, and went and was working actually as a working habitat off of Port Travis, by a group called the Deep Quest Adventures, and they ran a similar program that we had, and they were funded by the government. But then there was a government change, and the money's dried up for the program, basically dried up, and was left on the bottom in the Port Travis area, beside an underwater dive place called Duck's Dive. And when we found this out, Joe and I talked about it for a while, and we went down to Duck's Dive. And we talked to them about, we went diving on it. The owners come out and looked at us and said, come on up for coffee. And there was some clashes, I guess, with personalities. I won't go much more than that in a public forum. And basically, we're shown the door and said, and all the details you can read in Diver Magazine reprint if you're looking for it. Basically, they said that they owned it and get the hell out of our area. That you don't own it, and that's news to me. So it didn't go along very well. So out it went. I went back into Duck's Dive about maybe a year later, and since the conflict was between one of the individuals and McGuinness, I thought, well, maybe I can go back, and these guys don't get along. And it was a question of ownership. So I went down and I talked to the other owner of Duck's Dive, named Susan Yanko, and talked to her, and I thought I was negotiating in good faith to get this thing back up here. And we both agreed at the time, or I thought we both agreed at the time, that what should happen is that why would I want to take Sublimnos out of there, and then what am I going to do? Put it in my backyard? And I couldn't come up to Parks Canada to Frank Burroughs and just say, well, here it is. I mean, it's like getting a free dog. So I came back, and for the next 2 years, talked to a lot of people, and had a meeting with Frank, and I told him all about what the significance was, and he realized that this thing is significant. This is a big chunk of Canadian underwater history. It should belong up here. And Carol Reed was involved in that, and we ended up saying, well, this is where it should be. So I told Duck's Dive, unless, if you're going to shoot an arrow, you better know where the target is. So I said, I've got the target all set. Everything is in place. All you have to do is move it from A to B. What do you want to do with it? They ended up having, there was some personal problems with the owners of Duck's Dive, and all of a sudden all communication stopped. Communication was very, very bad to begin with anyhow. They'd never tell me what they wanted. Nothing. I didn't get emails. I didn't get anything. It was dead. And then I noticed on a further thing, and in the meantime, Duck's Dive had taken out of the water and they put it on shore. And the thing was now starting to rot. And Parks Canada will tell you all about things sitting on, when you take it out, things aren't good here, you better do something. And I told them at least put it back in the water. It sat there. And then I was going through a scuba board one day, and I find out this thing is no longer at Duck's Dive. Where is it? All we heard was that it was someplace else. We found it after a lot of sleuthing around, was that it's sitting at a paintball company in Picton, Ontario, and notice the big thing. There is a gate in front of it. And we have tried to contact these people, as have sources of knowledge people working on it, and Bill Graham and John Greenhouse, whoever. We tried to approach these people to talk. They won't say anything. They won't tell us whether they want money for it. They just completely silent on the thing. If I said, I'm not going to say what I'm thinking, but you know what I'm saying, I'm not going to say it in a public forum. But anyhow, we are still ongoing to this. This is going on. This is still going on, like as of 2-3 days ago, Bill, probably even. We're doing that now. We tried to get it back up here. We don't know whether they want $1, $10,000, $1 million, give it away, cut it up, or do anything. But the word ransom comes to mind. And this is where it sits. And during this thing, we'll be still talking about it amongst, see if we can get this thing repatriated. So we're wondering, is it going to end up on a landfill site? So we don't know. So this is the ongoing problem that we have with it. Or will it go to what we feel is the rightful home at Parks Canada? We've got it all set up. Original drawings for the for the Interpretation Center included a stand for Sublimnos in its planning. They weren't saying they were going to get it, but if you're going to be pouring cement, you might as well pour an extra pad, which is what they did. It's ready. But what about the other half? Look about what Cameron said about, for those who can't read it, I'll do it real quick and just paraphrase it. Well, it's about Cameron saying as a motivation he wanted to dive in the ocean, and that he saw the big cylinder down in at Royal Ontario Museum, and he wrote to McGuinness. It was an inspiration for him. McGuinness asked when he was doing follow-up on what does Sublimnos mean to me? Mike's comment was, Sublimnos was and is a vehicle that transformed dreams into realities that went far beyond imagination. It stimulates and inspires those that come in contact with it to go beyond what one thinks is possible. It is simple as that. I've seen it over and over. It continues today. I continually run into people from Sublimnos and what they did. They're older, they're younger, they know what it is. Young kids know it. You look on the scuba boards or whatever, you mention the word Sublimnos, you'll get all sorts of reaction. It should come home, but they know what it is. Why? This is my grandkid diving in the pool last year after I gave him a new mask and snorkel. He is hot on Titanic now. He knows who Grandpa does. He always seems to be traveling and going someplace and taking pictures of things that blow up, and or high-speed chase boats or. You got to be there. It's a lot of fun. Anyhow, and we look at that, and he's on the Titanic, and I said, I says, oh, I know a guy who dove on Titanic, McGuinness, and he says, would you like to meet him? And I says, oh, and he says, did he take anything? That's a grave site, And I go, oh, well, in my day, we of course took everything we could, including wheels from Brunelman's. And it's an inside joke that ain't so inside. And I thought, different way of thinking, different dreams, but it is a dream. And the younger people who talked after George did and after me and whatever, there's this passion there. And I've seen people who are engineers, and I've seen biologists, and it goes on and on and on. This thing was a spark. So that's one of the main reasons. So now I'm calling it the enduring spark beneath the ice, and the story's to be continued. But what's this anyhow? McGuinness says, would you make me a drawing? When McGuinness and I were driving back from Ducks Dive that day, we started talking about a thing called SubPod, Submersible Portable Observation Dome. I can tell you a lot about it if you listen to me later, but John's going to kill me if I talk any longer. And it kind of looks like this. And what if it was a little thing? And what if you put it on a trailer, and that it had a control van on it? And what if you had people working in it, and kids who were education programs, and it was sitting in the harbor here, and it ran education programs, and it had all sorts of things going on to make your little aquanauts. What if it had a ramp on it so disabled people can come in and be mission control and do all the rest of that stuff? And the biggest clue is, and the biggest change, what if it was all hooked up into the internet? And what if anybody could see it? What if the SubPod had cameras coming from it that people on the internet anywhere can change what they're looking at? What if we had one in Germany? What if we had one? What if? So, we need to talk. And it's not the end yet.